lasted for years. I don't know how it keeps living.
So Sanjay Sana Baba Rasavik, we really appreciate that. It's feels nice to be back at the Moser house. Yeah, so we have to do what we have to do to be safe and healthy so we can right? Continue the struggle. But before I stand here and even think that I can speak authoritatively on anything, I have to acknowledge my Igungun, my ancestors, the ones that made it possible for me to be here. And I ask for their guidance. So with that, as it is appropriate, I'm going to ask Baba Lumumba, can I continue? With that affirming smile, with that affirming
Good
chuckle.
question. Can you?
Yes, only you can answer that. That's a question that only you can answer.
Yeah, you as they say, well, you're damn right, bro.
Okay, that's a greater affirmation. Appreciate it. So,
Please.
with that, we come here this evening to really deal with a serious topic that has impacted the world globally. I'm a scuba diver. I dove off of a ship over 1,400 times into the wild blue yonder. And 700 of those dives have been on vessels we call so-called slave shipwrecks. And that has affected me profoundly. So hopefully I can share that experience with you this evening. And so in the context of what we'll be talking about, to kind of express that, I'm going to try to hit these topics real quickly to talk about the organization that I'm affiliated with, Diving with the Purpose, what we do and why we do it. And then more critically and more importantly, how we have to begin to decolonize the language, the narrative around this whole question of, quote, the huge quote mark, slavery. Okay? I have, I'll tell you in a moment, I've kind of consciously changed my narrative and my semantics around this question. Now we're going to deal a little bit with this thing called the so-called slave ship, because that's the central artifact in this phenomenon we call enslavement. We're going to take a look at what we know about them archaeologically, and then more importantly, how do we remember collectively as a people? What the loss of that memory has impacted on us and how we deal with the trauma from that experience, and how we get past the trauma and the silence and the shame of that experience that somehow we fail to talk about. And how do we begin to memorialize these millions of individuals that hadn't even been acknowledged? That's still I'm talking about doing something ritualistic around the loss of their lives. No one has never told them to rest in peace. So we'll talk a bit about that. And I'll wrap it up when we can deal with two very significant shipwrecks, the South Jose Paketi, Africa, and the one that I've been intimately working on in the last couple of years called the Clotilda, down in Mobile River, Alabama, right north of Mobile. And I close it out with how we give voice to the silence and how that experience of diving on these wrecks have, again, touched me deeply, and how we can begin to listen to those silent voices that's been screaming out for us to restore their humanity. So let's do that. And so real quick, I'm going to go through these real quickly. This is DWP, Diving with the Purpose. Got started back in 2003, roughly. And the primary mission of Diving with the Purpose is to document archaeologically, survey and document archaeologically these vessels that was involved in the enslavement of our people. And we go about that by training certified scuba divers to learn these skills of archaeology and how you document it by diving on them and what are you doing. Those are the skill sets we sort of teach. We do terrestrial works too in terms of doing the historical and cultural research about the people, particularly that was on these vessels, Because each one of these vessels we treat as very sacred sites. We do an immersion program down in South Florida every June. They do a land-based sort of training before we take them into the water. And then we take them into the water, put them to practice and learn those skills. And then they can go out and work on a project. Ultimately, as we look at these projects, we have to document them. So we create a map of what that wreck site looked like on the seafloor. And this is an example of one of those maps. We have a very strong youth program because we have to engage young people in this process. They're the next generation to do this work. And so we have a youth diving with a purpose program that teaches the archaeology and also coral reef restoration. We have a very powerful coral reef conservation program we call CARES, Collective Approach to Restoring Our Ecosystems. That's critically important because I don't know if you're aware the state of our coral reef systems. You probably heard of something here and there and then forgot about it. Under the ocean, out of mind, right? It's kind of like flushing the toilet. Once it goes, you forget about it, right? But it has to be dealt with. Every second breath that you take comes from these coral reef systems. Every second breath. And so what would happen if those coral reefs all of a sudden disappear? Folks know that they can see trees, right? You know, through the process of sun hitting those leaves, you can get oxygen from those leaves, right? But get more oxygen from this core system than to do those trees. And they only represent about 4% of the Earth's surface. So we need to take care of that system as well. Unfortunately, around the coastal USA, particularly around Florida, we've lost about 85% of those coral reef systems. I've dove on the Great Barrier Reef, that tremendous reef, which is a natural historic heritage site, is in serious threat as well. So we've lost over 50% of that system as well. And the process continues to happen mainly because of our behaviors, what we are doing as a collective.
Is that 50% in Florida or the world?
In Florida, it's about 70%. The Great Barrier Reef is around 50%, but globally, it's somewhere on average around 60 to 70%. And it's continuing to deteriorate because the seas are warming. And a 1 to 2 degree change in the temperature will affect these coral reef systems. And it's all interconnected. It's all interconnected. We cannot separate ourselves from these systems, what's happening in the water and on the land, terrestrial or in the marine environment. We are all connected. Believe it or not, humanity is just one profound interconnected spirit. Whatever we do to one thing is going to affect the other. And so we go about our daily lives being distracted with crazy politics and all this other madness, while we essentially, from my perspective, committing geological suicide. So I said geological, I mean ecological suicide. So we have to pay attention to what we're doing to our natural system, biodiversity particularly. We're losing species, et cetera, but that's a whole nother discussion. But anyway, we're trying to teach these young people to be sensitive to the marine environment. It's critically important. And very quickly, we just did some other work on the Tuskegee Airmen. This is an airplane that went down in Lake Huron and lost a life in that crash was Frank Moody, Lieutenant Frank Moody, Howard University graduate. He had trained down in Tuskegee, and he was flying, doing some live training up on Lake Huron after his training in Tuskegee, going about 300 miles over the lake, blasting his guns. He had 50 calibers on the nose and some machine guns in the wings. He lost his engine, and he went in at 300 miles an hour. So the reason that's important is this is a P-39 Aero Cobra. The engine is not here, the engine is here, behind him. And when he hit the water, the engine lost its balance and it came straight through the cockpit where he was sitting. Wow. And he was essentially decapitated. And about 2 months later, some kids found his body at washed ashore. So this is the cockpit here of that P-39 Cobra, not where Frank Moody was sitting, but this is an example of one. But what we found, this was found 70 years to the day by some folks that was doing some salvage work up there when he crashed into the ocean. And the reason that we know this here is because this number here. The number is his radio call number, 221-226. And so we know this is the plane that he was flying in. It's this aircraft. And that's me working on the tail section of that exact plane that he was flying. So we documented that site. These wings was probably the most predominant feature of that wreck. This is how we documented that. This is that wing section. Sorry, go back here real quick. Sorry.
And where would this again come out?
At Lake Huron, Michigan.
Great.
Great Lakes, one of the Great Lakes near Port Huron. Again, this is the artifact, the wings. This is the port side, the right side. The starboard side, and then port side over here. The starboard side tire, it still has air and it's still inflated. This is where Frank Moody was sitting. Engine came straight through. Again, you can see some of those identifying markings on it. And this is the crew that did the work on the aircraft. This guy is Wayne Lasardi. He's the state of Michigan archaeologist. These are my colleagues here. This lady works for NOAA up in Thunder Bay on the Great Lakes. This is Ernie Franklin. You all might know him. He's from DC. Actually, all these folks are from DC. That's Ernie Franklin, Jay Hagler, and Melanie Garrett. He's from Florida, Eric Denson. But they're all DWP members. So we put a obelisk up there, a Tekanu, a very black granite one. It's a beautiful monument to honor these individuals, not just Frank Moody. There's 4 other airplanes that's in Lake Huron. We know where one of them is, and we're searching for, with the work of the state archaeologists, searching for the other 3. We're taking some materials from the lake that's going to be put into the Frank Wright Museum in Detroit there. There's a Tuskegee Airmen Museum there, but I think they're going to merge. But anyway, it'll be in one of those museums up there in Florida that will tell this story. But this monument dominates the shoreline up there. Before we put it up there, this was a propeller from a ship that they were memorializing. But now with this thing up there, it just dominates the plaza. It's a very beautiful monument memorializing these brothers that went down in the lake.
What was so common about Michigan? You said 4 people.
Yeah, they went up there for training. There was an Army Air Base on Lake Huron up there in Michigan. And so after they finished their training, they went up there because that's sort of as close as they can get before they went over to World War II in the Mediterranean. So it's sort of a similar environment. And so they was doing live fire training in somewhat of a similar environment. We collaborate also with partners, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Slave Wrecks Project. We're a global partner with them, doing work all over the world. We'll talk about some of that maybe later. Some of the folks we collaborate with there. We collaborate with NOAA and down in the Florida Keys, where we do basically our training. We're training some local folks here too. You might know this person here. Anybody want to make a guess?
Kamau B.
You.
Good try, but no.
Is that Sabrina?
Yeah, it's Sabrina. Sabrina Johnson.
I was just say your hair's not that long.
Okay.
Yeah, she's taking the program. A hell of a diver too.
Oh.
We collaborate with these individuals, the Society of Black Archaeologists. These folks was doing land stuff, terrestrial archaeology. And sure, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you determine what you're going to go looking for, searching for?
Yeah, that's a good question. You want to hold it, put the asterisks by that, and I'll make sure I get to it.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's an excellent question. So these two, this brother and this sister here, that's Dr. Justin Donovan. This is Dr. Ayana Flewellen. Dr. Donovan and Justin, you call him. We taught them both how to scuba dive, and they're both working with Dive with Purpose now. She's on our board now. And Justin graduated from Howard University, magna cum laude, at age 16. Yeah, so he's done some very good work in decolonizing archaeology. Decolonizing the whole language. Archaeology, of course, was fundamental in perpetuation of racism, archaeology and anthropology. So he's done some critical work there. He's a professor now at UCLA, and Ayana is a professor now assistant professors now at Stanford University. They've done some critical work down in some so-called slave plantations down in the Caribbean, particularly in St. Croix. You might have seen this magazine, National Geographic, is the March 2022 issue. It documented the work that we was doing. We did a lot of thanks and praises to the sister here, Tara Roberts. She visited the museum, African American Museum, and saw these black divers and said, who in the hell are these people? And so she tracked us down, and we taught her how to scuba dive, and she just blew DWP up all over the world, essentially. She became a National Geographic explorer, and National Geographic has literally thousands of these people they call explorers. And she was named the #1 explorer for the year 2022 because of the work that she was doing with us. She's now on the continent of Africa, visiting every continent to tell these stories and narratives and make these connections. Doing some incredible work.
What's her name?
Tara Roberts. Yeah, Google it, you get a lot of stuff on it. So this was supposed to be the cover, the second cover, I call it. They decided to go with something else and look real close. This is Tara, and you see how the mask there is kind of fogged up. So they went with that other one. So I'm not upset. They gave me a centerfold anyway. So this is a centerfold that they in the magazine. And this is young lady here, just turned 22. We taught her how to scuba dive as well. And now she's working on her PhD out at UCLA under the tutelage of Justin and how to do this decolonizing work. So this is why I'm here to talk about this subject. This was under the waters. So let's begin with this decolonization of knowledge and the language and the whole narrative. The very first thing we have to begin with in talking about the subject of enslavement, that we were never slaves. We were never slaves. We were enslaved. Slavery interrupted our history. That was not the basis of our story. Right? So for me to get the language correct, I don't say that the transatlantic slave trade anymore. I call it the transatlantic era of African enslavement. Those people were enslaved. These Europeans didn't go to Africa to get slaves. What they got was mothers, fathers, griots, blacksmiths, carpenters. And they've got them to enslave them. So we have to be real clear on that. And so when I talk about this, I try very consciously not to say the word slave or slaves or slavery, unless it help clarify things for folks that hadn't made that sort of cognitive transition. So this was a great disaster for us. We call it the Ma'afa. So discussion questions, these are rhetorical questions. You don't have to answer, Bob, okay? Don't. Can you imagine what it would be like for folks online? That's an inside joke. Can you imagine what it would be like to live without your memory of who you are, where you came from, your history, your culture? No sense of who grandma was, where grandma grew up, what she passed on to you. Can you just imagine that? So memory connects a person to the history and ancestors. If you are disconnected from those ancestors and memory, how does it affect your identity, who you are? Your collective memory and your identity. I mean, without that connection to your ancestors, right? In African cosmology is the thought that when you're disconnected from your ancestors, you're walking around lost, misguided, wounded. It's like you got a huge hole in your soul that's missing something. And so that connection to the ancestors is real critical. More importantly, from historical, political, whatever way you want to look at it, here in the US, how did it become possible for a nation founded on the democratic principles of freedom and justice for all to allow over 250 years of chattel slavery and bondage for more than 5 million human beings? That's just in the US. But globally, how in the shaping of the so-called Western civilization as a global system of brutal bondage and oppression existed for more than 400 years and not be a part of our collective memory? Our daily discussions, actually, we are suffering from the consequences today of that very system. This whole discussion about racism and so forth and so on. So collective memory plays an important part in that. Collective memory is just stories, identity about people in their past and how we identified as a group. Our collective memory is totally distorted. We're still in the process of trying to answer that question. Who are we, right? We're still trying to answer that question. So in the most part, it's like amnesia, because this is the history of the transatlantic era of African enslavement is so painful, so torturous, so traumatic. You know, it takes a lot of emotional energy to talk about it, but we have to engage it if we want to talk about healing, right? But people always want to talk about healing, but how do you repair the harm? How do you repair the harm? And the harm that's been caused and restore justice. And cultural heritage is part of that memory as well. If you don't have that clarity on that identity question, you're gonna, identify with anything, right? Like this young man here down in Brazil, don't know who he is, so safe way out for him cognitively and emotionally is to whitewash himself. Just pour paint over his head and become white.
Is that what he do?
That's white paint is pouring over his head. And that's what this piece is illustrating. That's part of Afro-Atlantic Histories piece that was in, that's touring the world actually. It was down in Brazil, it was here in the US a few months ago. And restoring and reclaiming that memory is critically important. How do we go about reclaiming and restoring that memory? We have, even in this institution here, we call Umoja House, some deep intellectual conversations under the vocal leadership of Baba Lumumba. And those are important discussions, but we have to have that dialogue and those discussions and those conversations if we want to have that, restore that collective identity and to repair the harm that's been done to us collectively. I heard a brother on the radio today was talking, he was just smashing black folk. And he's supposed to be a conscious brother. I'm not going to call him out, but, no, he's a very prominent brother too. And so it was very painful to hear him say this because we have to get over this thing, this notion of victims victimizing victims, VVV. Victims victimizing victims. Every time they do that, the white supremacists are just giving them what? Standing ovations. Keep that up. That's nice behavior. So we have to check our behavior and make sure we're always working toward constructive results, right? So an important part of that reclamation process is recognizing the value and the knowledge that's been based in the oral tradition, right? The oral tradition has been minimized anthropologically as in terms of a serious database of knowledge and information. And so, but we have to give that some very important attention because memory retention is fundamental to the oral tradition, right? You have these griots that can recollect and give back their history of 200 and 300 years without missing a word every time. So that's a profound memory. But more importantly, for us, particularly in this generation, and what technology has done to us, made us dependent on other things as opposed to our brains, is that it's been shown that traditions that have scripts or writings show how their memory has decreased over time. The ability to recall and remember has declined. But folks in the oral traditions have much better memory as they grow older, that they can retain and recall things real critically. And more importantly, in those societies, what was more important was the oral, the speech, your voice, your word, right? If you told a lie, that was essential to capital punishment, right? So you was held to your word in these societies. So if I ask Baba Imam or somebody, say, what's the definition of existential? You say, let me Google that.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And it's affected us all, in terms of the impact and decreasing our ability to remember. I just got back from Houston just yesterday, and I was getting ready for the thing at the gallery last night, and I knew I had this black shirt, right? Because I had it in Texas, and I wanted to wear it, and I spent about 15, 20 minutes. I know I had it. It was in my suitcase. I went running through my suitcase, looking for everything in my suitcase. And then I looked, maybe I threw it in the dirty clothes. I went through the dirty clothes and said, damn, I must have left it in the hotel room. And I said, oh, well. So I went to get ready to undress to get in the shower. I had the shirt on.
Oh, no. Come on.
I had the shirt on. So it impacts us all.
Oh.
It impacts us all. I mean, it's like having the glasses on top of your head and you don't know where they are, right? So the oral tradition is the point. let's don't belittle it. There's a lot of embedded knowledge there in terms of how we can get back to who we were. And this whole discussion about the transatlantic era of African enslavement, we know there was tremendous murder, terror, and torture, and trauma, and pain. That's very evident throughout that history. We can talk about some of that. But what is more important for us, we have to remember there was resistance. There was resistance inland. There was resistance on the west coast of Africa. There was resistance during the crossing. There was resistance at the ports on this side of the world. There was resistance on the so-called plantations. That resistance was continuing in almost every day over the 400-year history. So we didn't just passively say, come get us and we'll work for you for free for 400, 500 years. There was resistance. This brother here, Simle Pai of Amistad, you might know him as Joseph Sinkay, and some of the more noted resistance movements, Nat Turner, making his plans, Zumbia Palmares, who resisted the Portuguese for a very long time down in Brazil. So we have to keep that resistance in front of us. But also what's important is the trauma that it has caused. And this trauma has been passed on from generation to generation. We call it epigenetic trauma. It's transformed from one generation to another. It actually put a marker on our genes from the stress of that trauma. And the trauma from the transatlantic era of African enslavement, I can't think of any other human being or human family that experienced the level of trauma that our ancestors experienced during that experience. So that trauma causing us to act and behave in certain ways. That VVV I talked about earlier, victims victimizing victims, And of course, Tyree Nichols, what happened there? Was that part of that trauma? So we have to be very, very cognizant of how the system has caused this trauma in our behavior and watch our every actions and behaviors every day as we move about. Every time I was reading this morning, some brother is doing some crazy, bizarre things, just beating up people just for the hell of it, and abusing people, and actually murdered this little girl. It's just tragic. We can read about those stories from now on. They're always going to continue to happen unless we can change that behavior. How do we change that behavior? By becoming aware of what is happening to us, right? If we're not aware of what is causing those behaviors and what is happening to us under this global system that has been operating for over 500 years, we're going to continue to play out there. We're going to continue to be distracted by these events, continue to see them on the news 20 years from now. By the way, I meant to mention that. Let me just take a pause here, brother, if I can. There's an African proverb that says that every time a child is born, the world gets another chance. And I want y'all to know that Kwasi Omawale has just came into the world, my first grandchild.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
So the world is going to get another chance here with this young brother. This is the first time he laid eyes on me. I touched him.
Great.
Yeah. So I'm sure his behavior is become critically important for us. I don't want to see him dealing with the same issues I'm dealing with here, when he becomes a young man, a young boy. So that epigenetic trauma is with us. And just metaphorically, because we're dealing with water here, and we all somehow is connected to water, consciously or subconsciously. How many of y'all can swim here? Raise your hands. Well, about half, a little bit. Okay, enough to save yourself. Huh? That's good. So, but this water is a very powerful metaphor, right? Toni Morrison said, all water is a perfect memory. It is forever trying to get back to where it was. So water and collective memory, we're trying to get back to what? Our tradition of greatness, and even better, something better. So we're connected to the water. And this sister, Khalida, or Robert Rawlings out in California, had this beautiful piece I used to express that metaphor. These are two sisters under the water. Are they in distress? Are they dancing or being playful? Are they experiencing joy? What is it? Well, this is an illustration of that trauma, that epigenetic trauma. What does that, look at their arms there. What does that imply to you?
They're joining together in some kind of way, or connecting.
DNA helix.
That's what it looks like, yeah. I even see like connecting lines in between the...
And just the outer bounds, but this is metaphor, right?
That's it.
Yeah. So water is essential, and we need to stay connected to that water in order to restore that collective memory we was talking about this brother, Derek Walcott from St. Vincent in the Caribbean, he wrote a piece called Sea is History. And just a piece out of that long poem he wrote said, bones, solid bones by coral to bones, mosaic, mantled by the benediction of the shark's shadow. That on this Atlantic seabed is millions of our people. No one knows of them, about them. Their voices have never been heard. Who's telling their stories? They are mosaics now, soldered to the core. Millions. Can we name just one of those individuals? Millions. That's supposed to be part of our collective memory. This sister here, Lucille Clifton, she was the Port Laureate of Maryland, actually, at one time. She wrote a piece, Atlantic is a Sea of Bones. Atlantic is a sea of bones, my elegant Africans, connecting Ouida and New York, a bridge of ivory, seabeds, they call it. Acknowledging those individuals, those souls, those spirits, is lying on the Atlantic seabed. We're in the era of profound technologies now that needs strategic minerals, materials, in order to build the tools and so forth, the machines to implement these technologies, and they're searching for those minerals on the Atlantic seabed. They're going to disturb those spirits down there for sure. How do we prevent that from happening? And not only prevent it, how do we appropriately memorialize those individuals, those souls that's laying on the seabed? UNESCO said it's not just the wreck themselves, pieces of the ship, the materiality that's on the seabed. We have to address also human remains also when we're talking about cultural heritage on the seabed. So during the transatlantic era of African enslavement, ships was crossing. Some of them didn't make it. Lost over 15 to 20% of individuals. How many does the academics say came across? So they say about 12.4 million, right? I say it was about 15 to 20 million. Dr. Clark said it was 60 million. Mm-hmm. We know it was tens of millions for sure. And so you take 10 to 15% of that. How many individuals is that is laying on the bottom of the Atlantic seabed? If you use the academics number, you can come up with about 2 million Africans on the bottom of the Atlantic seabed whose voices have been silenced. We don't know who they are. No one has never told those individuals to rest in peace ritualistically. So they're still speaking to us and want us to acknowledge them. So as part of our organization, National Association of Black Scuba Divers, we did back in the early 90s, put down a memorial marker on the Henrietta Marie. That's down in Mobile. But Henrietta Marie was an enslavement vessel that had dropped off about, I think it's roughly 300 individuals in Jamaica. It was heading back to England with all the loot that it got from selling those individuals. A storm came up off the Florida Keys that was trying to turn the corner and head back to Europe, and the vessel sunk. It was discovered by this treasure hunter. He wasn't looking for this Henrietta Marie. He just happened to look for it because he was looking for the Spanish galleon called the La Tosha that had $400 million in gold on it. He found it and got filthy rich. So that's another story, but he did do some good archaeology on this project and made some commitments, used some of that money to archaeologically document that. And there's an exhibition. It was over in Baltimore one time. It's going around the country. So if you happen to see it, go check it out. So slavery and the collective memory and the slave shipping, what that slave ship role the slave ship plays in restoring that memory. I think it's the key artifact as we do this work. Why? Because Marcus Rediker wrote this book called The Slave Ship, or Human History. And he has a section in there that's worth reading to show you the importance of the slave ship. And it's instructive if we read it, I think. He said the ship was essential to a profound, interrelated set of economic changes, essential to the rise of capitalism. No question about it, right? The seizure of a new land, the expropriation of millions of people and their redeployment in growing markets, oriented sectors of the economy, the mining of gold and silver, the cultivating of tobacco and sugar, the concomitant rise of long-distance commerce, and finally, the planned accumulation of wealth and capital beyond anything in the world we have ever witnessed. Slowly, fitfully, unevenly, but with undoubted power, a world market and international capitalist system was created and emerged. Each phase of the process, from exploration to settlement to production to trade and the construction of new economic order, required massive fleets of ships and their capacity to transport both expropriated laborers and the new commodities. And the Guineaman, which is essentially the slave ship, was the most important piece of that system. So let's explore that. Those so-called slave ships. These show some of the routes those vessels took. But in that era of transatlantic enslavement, there was some 12,000 ships involved in that era. 12,000, right? They took some 40,000 voyages during this whole period across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. We know that out of those 12,000, there was about 1,000 or so that was involved in recording events. Probably much more, but these are the ones that we're aware of. And the location of which only about 15 are known, and less than 10 of those have been documented scientifically, archaeologically, right? Out of how many? 12,000. We only know about 15 or so. Why is that? Where you live? No, seriously, that's a good question. Why is that? Well, it's a global system of white supremacy. This is not something that is of interest to empowering, Black folk. They've exploited, they're done with it, and we're done with it. Let's take it out of our collective memory, i.e., Ron DeSantis, Florida, take it out of collective memory. You don't need to know this no more. We got the upper hand now, we got the power. But we need to bring it back in our collective memory. So we're going about the business of each one of these vessels as a powerful story to tell by themselves. Out of those 12,000 vessels that was involved in the trade, can you all name me at least 5 other than Amistad? Clotilda, yes, that's one.
Marietta Marie.
Marie, that's 2. I just showed you those.
The Pearl.
Pearl was 1, yes. 12,000, now you got a huge database. So we need to bring those back into memory because that's how our ancestors suffered. That's how we got here. That's what impacted the global world. And that's what's impacting our consciousness right now in our interrelationships. So it involves some 12 to 15 million captive human beings, right? Again, academics say 12.4, but it's much more than that. But of the largest forced migration, that term is a little tricky, but there was forcibly moved in human history, the largest in human history. But yet, it's not part of our collective memory. This is a graphic that shows you over that time period, over that era of enslavement, roughly 400 years. And highlighted here is Portugal. I was in Lisbon, Portugal back in January, and you can see that in this last half of the 18th century, they moved over 4 million of our ancestors, 4 million of our people. Okay? But in Lisbon, in Portugal, there's no memorialization of that fact. There's no memorialization of, if you go there, you might see maybe one small monument. But if you go down on the riverfront, where these ships departed out of Lisbon to do these dastardly deeds, there's a massive, almost 200-foot granite edifice glorifying Henry the Navigator and all the exploits of exploring the world and so forth. Nothing about the victimization and the trauma of African people. So we were there trying to create some dialogue and discussions with the Afro-Portuguese community and the broader community in museums there. Lonnie Bunch was with us and was having these conversations about how to do this quote anti-racist work and bring back these stories into the collective memory. So here's some of the 15 that we kind of know about. 5 of those, the ones that's happening. Henrietta Maria, of course, the Guerrero, the South Jose, up the coast of South Africa. We'll talk about that in a bit. Troubadour, Peter Morel. This one is Turks and Caicos, where it went down. This is an incredible story by itself in the Bahamas. There was a rebellion, and they took over the ship. Eventually, it wanted to go on a port into in the Caribbean, but they ended up in Bahamas. And So when they got to the Bahamas, they said, well, the Bahamas belonged to the British at the time in 1860. And so they said, well, these British had abolished the importation of Africans into British territory and said, y'all are free. And so they just walked off the ship and populated Bahamas. Clotilda, we'll talk about in some depth. The Ouida, Queen Anne's Revenge.
Is that named after Ouida in
That's
Benin?
correct, yeah. It was a pirate vessel. It was ended up being a pirate vessel. It was Dahomey, but ended up being Benin, current day Benin. So when it was found, it had been repurposed. A pirate took over the vessel. So some of the individuals on the vessel, and they started using it for its pirating activities. It went down off the coast of New York, actually, and it was found back in '86 by this dude named Barry Clifford. Queen Anne's Revenge was another, was Blackbeard's one, right? Was it Blackbeard? I keep getting these pirates confused, but that was found off in North Carolina. It was formerly an enslavement vessel as well. And those other ones there. These are very interesting as well. Christiana's Quintus and Frederica's Quintus off the coast of Costa Rica. Had hundreds of Africans on it, and the captain misnavigated and got lost. He got caught in a storm off the coast of Costa Rica. The ship's wrecked, and again, the individuals on that was eventually, they just walked off the vessel. Somehow they got out of their restraints, and most of them just walked off the vessel because the real shadow warning waded into the community there in Costa Rica. Been down there a couple of times, and there's a community down there of descendants down there, the community from these vessels. The Adeline and James Matthews, this was ended up off the coast of Australia, of all places. It was repurposed after the trade, and it was used as a freighter. So I'm going to kind of skip through some of these. I want to talk about the story of some of these, but it'll take some time here. But of course, I want to spend most of the time on these two vessels here, the South Sadiki, the African Clotilda. But nonetheless, I'll highlight them. The Merriman was a Dutch East Indian Company vessel, and they was involved in all sort of commodities, including human beings. The important figure in the Merriman is Masavana. He was from Madagascar. He was a freedom fighter, and they were sailing from Madagascar, coming around the Cape. By the time they got in halfway there, they revolted. Masavana revolted, and they took over the ship. And once they took over the ship, they found they couldn't sell it, didn't have the skills to sell it, so they negotiated with the main crew that they didn't kill to sell them back to Madagascar. And the surviving crew, they retreated back in the back of the ship and locked themselves up to protect themselves. And the captain wrote a note, threw it out the window, a bottle, really just threw it out the window. And Masavana had told them that if this is Madagascar, we're going to send a crew aboard, and they find Madagascans, they're going to light 3 fires on the beach. And that's what the captain had written on this note. And there was a militia that had showed up, saw this mysterious ship out over the water. And when they found the bottle, they lit 3 fires. Masavana said, wow, this is Madagascar, but don't smell like Madagascar air. This is not Madagascar birds. But let's go. Let's abandon the ship. They abandoned the ship. The ship went adrift. We think it crashed on the beach somewhere. That's been colleagues are searching for it. Masavana was arrested. Some of his crew, some of his people were killed. He was put on trial, and he was, his trial signature was an X. That's in the archives, and he's out. His remains are somewhere on this island here. This is Cape Town. This is Lion's Head. Remember that? And this is Robben Island. So we think Masavana's remains is on this island, but they buried him. Nelson Mandela was in prison. The Zong is another horrific tragedy. In 1781, incompetent captain misnavigated. He was trying to get into Jamaica, and he was about 2 days out away from Jamaica, past Jamaica, and then had to double back. He didn't have the provisions to make it back. So he came up with this dastardly idea to throw 132 individuals overboard. First day he threw over 54 Africans. 2 days later, 42, and 26 more before he pulled into the Black River, Jamaica. 10 of them committed suicide. And he told them that you want to collect the insurance on them. He didn't win. There was other vessels as well. This is another example of Africans being thrown overboard, whose remains on the Atlantic seabed. The Le Rodour in 1819, there was this incredible disease, conjunctivitis, it's a blindness disease of the eyes. The whole crew and the enslaved people caught the disease. So he just started throwing them overboard. The Lewiston. The Lewiston is another horrific story. Again, this is just a few of those 12,000, right? So the Lewiston was a massive vessel. It had almost 700 individuals on it. It's a Dutch vessel. In 1738, because of an incompetent captain, this misnavigated as well. It was trying to get into Suriname and went up the wrong river. It turned around, came out the mouth of the river. A storm came up, and he tried to ride out the storm. He dropped the anchor on the bow, dropped the bow anchor. The bow anchor took hold, swung the ship around into the reef. The stern of the vessel slammed into the reef and breached the hull. It started taking on water, and the captain knew that he was going to lose the ship. So he gave the order to the crew to abandon ship. When he told them to abandon ship, they had one more thing to do. That is, lock down the hatches to prevent the escape of 700 individuals. Over a 2-3 day period as that ship broke up, they fell into the sea. Who's going to tell this story? Who's going to remember them? Right? This is just one of many of those stories. The Guerrero is another story. We've been working on this for quite a while. It was a pirated vessel. They had these stories get absolutely, how could someone imagine these things? 560 Africans was aboard the Guerrero. All of them had been hijacked from another vessel. They had been stolen, hijacked. The original vessel had left the coast of Africa, and Gomez, the captain of the Guerrero, saw it. He stole them individuals off that ship and was heading down to Cuba, trying to get them to Cuba. But again, the British and the U.S. had abolished the importation of Africans into the U.S. 1807, 1808. And so they had ships patrolling the seas, the so-called African Squadron. There's a vessel over here on Inner Harbor, over in Baltimore, the Constellation. It was one of those ships that was used for that patrolling. It was a haphazard sort of effort over the roughly 40-year history from 1820, from the Piracy Act to about 1860. And if you were caught importing Africans into the U.S., it was capital punishment. You would be hung. And over that 40-year period, you know how many individuals or captains of these vessels, when they have imported literally tens of thousands more, how many was actually prosecuted and hung?
0.
Actually, only one.
Or the last one.
And the very last one, actually. And that was in 1862. Lincoln signed the execution order. His name was Nathaniel Gordon. Google him. It's just a great story. It's incredible. He tried to bring some Africans into Brazil. They caught him, but he escaped by dressing up as a woman. And then for about 10 more years, he went back to his dastardly deeds of importing Africans into enslavement. But he got caught up with them in 1862 while the war was going on, and it was a political move by Abraham Lincoln. But that's another
He was trying
story.
to bring them into the United States or Brazil.
When he got caught, initially he was trying to bring them into Brazil on a vessel called the Camargo. And we're telling that story, looking for that vessel. Yeah, but he got caught off the coast of Congo with the intent of bringing them into the U.S. And so they busted him off the coast of Congo. So these are some of the things that we think came off the vessel that was pursuing the Guerrero. This is called a carronade, a little short gun, a short cannon, if you will. These are some of what's called the shots. These are bar shots and cannonballs. These bar shots are fired out of these cannons, so they just start flipping and rip up all the sails and the riggings of the ship and disable it so it can be captured. If you're ever down in the Florida Keys, there's a beach down there, in Key West particularly, Higgs Beach. Some of the about 3 or 4 maybe individuals that was on the Guerrero is buried on that beach. But more importantly, there's about 295 Africans that are buried on this beach. They were buried on that beach for more than 150 years. No one was aware of it. Until about 2002, anthropologists down there, archaeologists, were looking for some of the Guerrero victims, and he was doing ground penetrating radar. Just take this thing across the land and you can see what's under the soil. And he started seeing not just 2 or 3, 10, 20, 30 more. Ultimately, hundreds of these graves was right on this beach where people were doing their thing, sunbathing and so forth and so on. So we put this memorial there, was put there. A local brother, Gene Tierney, led this effort. And you can see the Akan symbolism here. That's telling the story about these 3 vessels, those individuals that was on it, that got interred there on that beach.
So real quick about what you're saying is that the Catilla was not the only vessel in 1860 that was imported here in the United States.
The historical record shows that it was the last one. But during the period when it was prohibited, and the Clotilda, there was many more that came into the U.S. in various sort of ways. And as you know, being from Charles County, they used, in Maryland, it's where they bred these individuals. And so the intra-trade kicked up, and up north, up south, and then they shipped them down south into these southern plantations. Well, let's talk real quickly about the South Jose Paquete, Africa. This is a vessel that was sailing from Mozambique around the Cape, going into, trying to get to Brazil, Maranhão, Brazil, but it crashed off the coast of Cape Town. And this is, I'm going to kind of skip this. This is a little movie that tells the story about the South Jose. But
African slave rates.
I want to just get to this because it tells this is the deposition when it wrecked. The captain was interviewed, and this is how he explained how the wreck happened and so forth. But at the end, he decided to save the slaves and the people. Made a clear distinction between what? That these were not people.
The slaves and the people.
Yeah.
Wow.
212 individuals went down in that wreck. And as I mentioned earlier, the lion's head we talked about, that gave us a clue. He said it went down off the lion's head. That's the lion's head here. This is Cape Town. And South Jose is right over there among these rocks here. The lion's head is up here on the hill. This is the rock called Cherry Rock that took down the South Jose. This beach here is called Clifton Beach in Cape Town. That's the rocks there. And during the apartheid era, these condominiums popped up on the beach. These exclusive condominiums. And we confirmed the South Jose in 2015. There were some local divers that knew that was a wreck there, but they didn't know what it was. And they stole some of the artifacts off it, but it was confirmed. So this is the first wreck that was involved in the trade where Africans actually lost their lives that we know about. There were many, many more. If we find the Lucin, that would be a huge find. But this is the very first one. This again, look at the wreck site. This is the beach here. This is the reef here. That's where that Cherry Rock is. And some of the artifacts that we located. And when we do this work, we put in a reference line here. It's called a baseline. And these little points here is points of significant artifact or something that's important is on these reference points. There's cannons on the site. That's a picture of the cannons that's on the site. And these artifacts here, these bars, these iron bars, they're called ballasts. And they're used to stabilize the ship. You have all these individuals on the ship. If a lot of them is up front, you need to balance the back or to the left or right and so forth. So they have to move these things around to get balance. So when they're on the way, be on the way as efficient as possible. So we claimed some of these, and they are on exhibit actually in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you ever been over there, there's an exhibit dedicated to the South Jose in the museum. Found some of the riggings from the sail.
We saw that. I saw that.
The exhibition, yeah. One of those shackles is this one. This is one that I located actually. It's in that film that I skipped through. I should have probably showed it, but we did some conservation work on some of the ballasts and other materials that we found while we were there. To show you where these people came from, this is Mozambique here. This is South Africa, Mozambique, South Africa. Point here, this is Madagascar. There's an island there called Mozambique Island. Mozambique Island before you go out into the Indian Ocean. And there's a bay here called Musaril Bay. And right across the bay is Musawil District. That's where those Makua people and a few other ethnic groups who was on the South Suze, that's where they came from. At least that's where they embarked on the South Suze. And so this individual here was one of the elders. Ivano Ngosh was an elder of the Makua people. We went back and told them, as I mentioned earlier, when you're disconnected from your ancestors, that's something that is you have to deal with daily. So we told them we found the location where your ancestors perished. And he was overjoyed, of course, and we spent the whole day just celebrating. And he spent most of the day telling us the history of the Makua people. And when he finished, he gathered up some soil from the village and put it in this vessel here with these carriage shells on it. He gave that vessel to Lonnie Bunch. This is Lonnie Bunch here, currently the secretary of the Smithsonian. And Lonnie Bunch gave it to me. And we took that vessel to acknowledge these individuals because this is the last visual that they saw of their homeland. This is the so-called ramp of slaves. And looking back at it, that's the last visual they saw of their homeland. We took that to that location, Clifton Beach. This Cherry Rock there I mentioned earlier. It's a big press was there from all over the world, global press, journalists from all over the world. And a Makua sister, this is Yara, this a sister from South Africa, Tara, and myself representing the diaspora. We ritualistically deposit this soil. The elder told us that we want you to take this soil to that wretched place and bring our people back home.
Mm.
So we deposited that soil. It was kind of rough. The seas was rough. The intent was to scuba dive on it and deposit it, but we couldn't because of the rough seas. We did the ritual. The day was overcast. It had started raining. The seas was rough. And as Lonnie Bunch sometimes tells the story, and I do recall that as soon as we deposited the soil, a calmness seriously came over the waters.
Looks pretty rough in that picture.
Yeah, they are. That's a wave back
Right.
here. This is a wave coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you saw it in the other one where it was breaking, almost to our waist. One of them there. So the water was pretty rough, but there was a calmness. The rain stopped, and there was a peace that settled over the place. So we went back to the Makua village and told this elder that we had fulfilled this mission. That's what he told us to do. And there was a profound pregnant pause, and he said, now that the rains that falls on our village, it's like the tears of our ancestors returning to nourish our land. So let's talk a little bit about the Clotilda, and we'll sort of wrap it up in terms of resistance. You might have heard a lot about the Clotilda story. In 1860, this wealthy shipbuilder named Timothy Mayer, he made a bet that he can...
What year was it San Jose? I'm sorry.
1794. Yeah, Guerrero was 27. South Jose was 94. This is 1860. They made a bet that they can thumb his nose up at the north. You know, things was very, very heated between so-called North and South, but you know, it was complicity among both. Most of these vessels that was involved in the trade in the U.S. was built up north. So, you know, this North-South thing, you know, we got to control the narrative there as well and explain that very, very clearly, those dynamics. But there was complicity in the North. It was making a lot of money from the enslavement of our people. So anyway, this guy made a bet that he can do it. And so he had the Clotilda built, and they sailed from Mobile in March 1860, went to Ouida. That's the city I mentioned earlier. It was Dahomey at the time. Got 110 individuals and brought them back to Mobile, Alabama. He talks about that in his article. That's him. That's Captain William Foster. But after he did this deed, he knew that the Federals was going to come down and be looking for evidence, individuals in the ship and so forth. So Captain Foster did something a captain typically doesn't do. He was told to take it further up the Mobile River that flows into the Alabama River. Alabama River flows into the Mobile River. But anyway, it's the Mobile River. He was told to burn it. He tried to burn it. It sank before it was fully consumed, fortunately. And there's evidence of it. Let's give you sort of a perspective here. This is Mobile. The descendants of that wreck in 1867, I'll talk a little bit about that real quickly later, we established a community called Africa Town. It's still there today. And this is 12 Mile Island, and this is where the location of the wreck is right there. This is 12 Mile Island, get a close-up of where the wreck lies, where he tried to destroy it. And that becomes significant. In March of 2018, a local reporter thought he had found the Clotilda when the river level had dropped. And this here's the image is always published. And so they called us in to do the archaeology to prove whether that was the Clotilda or not. I said, no, it's not the Clotilda. It's too long, it's too wide, made of the wrong material and so forth and so on. And so the descendant community down there started calling it the no-tilda. No-tilda. But anyway, we told us to come back. We came back in July of 2018. We brought some heavy equipment with us. This is a side scan sonar. This is a magnetometer. This thing makes pictures of what's under the water. This thing detects metal material underwater. We had a sub-bottom profiler. It looks beneath the surface of the riverbed. And we collected about 30 points of interest, if you will. Narrowed it down to about 5, and then 3, and then we located the Clotilda. This buoy marked where it's located. And there's a house right here, a fishing house. And all this property along here belongs to Timothy Mears' descendants. How do we know that? There's a marker right off that buoy that says Mears. So this is where that marker is right in here. So we knew he tied it up on the Mears property here. So this is some of the images from that side scan sonar. We see that. This is the Clotilda right here. Feast your eyes on that, because nothing in the historical record exists. Of the 12,000 vessels involved in the trade, you will not ever see a whole ship like this. The hull, the outline of the ship, this is the bow, the stern of the ship, and more importantly, this space right here I'll talk about in a minute. All the other shipwrecks that are scattered, broken up, we can find anchors and other pieces of wood and so forth and so on. Here we have a whole vessel. Makes this extremely unique for the anthropological record. And this shows you some of the components, areas of the ship. And so we went back and did a more detailed effort, collected some artifacts from the vessel. This thing here is called a centerboard. We know that Clotilda had a centerboard. It's about a 12-foot by 15-foot thing that drops down in the water when it's going across the water to keep it from yawing so much, help it stabilize itself. And when it goes into the shallow water, just bring it up out of the water. You've seen some on sailboats, these things hanging down. This nail pattern here was very, very interesting. Archaeologically, we knew that the Clotilda had copper sheeting on the side of it to keep these sea worms from eating up the wood. These terminal worms that would eat up the wood and destroy it. So it had put on copper siding to prevent that when it's out in the sea. And so this is somewhere they nailed some of that copper to the side of the hull. The type of wood it was made of, we knew it was made of white oak, white pine and oak. Analyzed the wood, white pine, oak. We knew how the ship was built because it was registered. We found a registry, 1855 registry of the Clotilda. It had all this information, that it was a schooner, had the centerboard that we found, it was 83 feet long, 23 feet wide, about 7-foot depth of hull, right? Could carry about 120 tons, and what it was made of, oak and yellow pine. Excuse me. And so from our analysis, this is what we came up with. About 86 feet long, 23 feet wide, the hull was about 7 feet, the tonnage, the material it was made on, what was used to build it, the centerboard, the copper sheeting, where it was sunk. And we knew it was sunk in 20 feet of water because William Foster, the captain, said so. It was sunk in 20 feet of water. So all that lined up, and we knew we had the Clotilda. And this is an incredible book that you should get and read if you want to know more about the Clotilda. Sister wrote this book. She's a professor at Hampton University, Natalie Roberts. I was with her a couple of weeks ago at the museum there in Hampton Roads. It's very, very African-centered book. But there's others out there as well. This sister wrote the book, Dreams of African Alabama, Ethiopian, Simeon Jeff. And you might have seen this one.
Can you go back to the first one?
The slave ship Clotilda and the Making of Africatown, USA. Spirit of our ancestors, Natalie Robertson. Next time, bring your dumb phone and just take a picture of it.
I got you.
No, I have a big life I can share with you as well at some point. But this one is really, really turned on the story of the Clotilda, the work of Zora Neale Hurston. She spent a lot of time interviewing this individual here, Oluwale Kazula, and they know him as Kojo Lewis down there. That's the name that he took on. But this book was published in 2018, but she wrote this book back in 1927. But the publishers didn't want to publish it because Zora Neale was very insistent that we're not going to change the language that he spoke in. Yeah, they wanted to change it to the English language so everybody can understand it. They would say, no, that's not authenticity. He spoke, and this is how he spoke. This is how I want to publish. So it languished for a very long time until the assistant, Deborah Plant, she edited it, went over to the house. So the transcript was over in Stringard. She went and got it and did some work and published it.
Now, Kamau, real quick. They were saying that he was the oldest of the people that came on that ship. But I also read recently, but it was a sister who was lived to be 110 years old, was actually the oldest. Do you know anything about that?
Matilda McRae. And we remember them by calling out their names. So let's call out their names when we get to that sister.
Okay.
Oluwale Kazula.
Uluwale Kozula.
Ridoshi Sally Adams.
Ridoshi Sally Adams.
Matilda McRae.
Matilda McRae.
She's a sister of the oldest, the last survivor.
Okay.
Kupoli Poli.
Poli.
Osa Kabe.
Osa Kabe.
Abachi Claire Turner. Charlie Lewis.
Charlie Lewis.
Gompa Peter Lee.
Peter Lee.
And so those are the individuals, a few of them, that established their community down there called Africa Town. And right after the Civil War, they approached that Timothy Mear guy and asked them to give them some land so they can farm and build their own community. They said, you must be out of your mind. I brought you here to make money for me. I'm going to give you some land. And so they pooled their resources heroically and went back to him and had to buy the land from him. And they bought the land, established this community called Africa Town. The only real remnant there is from Gompa Peter Lee's homestead, this chimney here, where his house was. But the state of Alabama put this highway right smack down through the community, totally devastated. I don't know if you've seen the movie Descendant, but it talks about some of this.
So on Netflix. Yeah.
It's streaming on Netflix. And so the community has been devastated by economic racism, environmental racism, total neglect, but people have been incredibly resilient. This was a vibrant community during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There was houses along this road. It was just a regular road street here, essentially. And there was houses where the descendants community had houses. And this community destroyed it. And the church that Kazulu founded and the cemetery where they are buried was split in half by this road here. This is the church that he founded. And that was a monument to him right there in front of the church. This is the church today that's honoring him, memorializing him. And across from the church is what we call Africa Town Cemetery, Old Plateau Cemetery. Africa Town is made up of about 3 or 4 communities: Plateau Magazine, Lewis Quarters, and a couple of others. A neighboring black town called Pritchard. But this is the cemetery here that have all that descendant community in it. There's a monument honoring Kazulu. Don't know exactly where his grave is, but this monument was erected to honor his presence in this graveyard. He died in 1935, and I think Matilda McRae transitioned around 1939, I believe it was, 38 or 39. 1940. There was a scholar in Britain that did some of that research. So back in May of last year, we did some more intensive work on the Clotilda. We wanted to extract some more artifacts to continue to tell this story. We pulled up 94 pieces from that wreck. We had commercial divers working with us. These are some of the pieces of the wreck. As I'll show you in that sonar image. Some images have been broke. Some of the material had broken off from the wreck. So we looked at all that material. We analyzed it, cataloged it, and made records of it. We put back 90 of them, but we saved 4 of them to conserve them. And you can see here, that's a hawse pipe, piece of the ship. But this piece here is probably the most important piece. We kept them in this water to kind of preserve them before we put them back. This is a pulley. And the pulley is the mechanism they use to control the rudder of the vessel. And so what's most extraordinary about that pulley, if you look at it real carefully, this is it here. This is the rope is still embedded in the run of that pulley. And that's an important diagnostic in terms of how that rope was braided, the type of twine that was used. And different manufacturers braided in different ways for different types of rope. So once this get all cleaned up, we'll be able to look at that rope and get some more information about the building of Clotilda.
You say y'all put it back where?
Back on the wreck.
Oh, is that right?
Back on the wreck, yeah. In a sacred place. There's something called the forecastle of the wreck. It's a big space up front. And so we put all the material we took out back into that space. Not exactly where it came from. It was all disarticulated, broken off from the wreck. So we just stored it there and made a record of it. So I mentioned I was in Lisbon, Portugal, and did a paper at this conference called was a symposium on the trade. And we're trying to change, again, the narrative, decolonize the knowledge. And as you know, when archaeologists look at these artifacts, they measure them, they cut it, they probe and prick and so forth and so on. So my thing was that there's another dimension, another aspect that should pay attention here. That's the spiritual aspect. The whole story on how I ran across this shackle on South Jose. This is part of the hull, the upper hull, the top part of the hull. We call the gun wall, the very top of it. And we know that some of our ancestors grabbed hold of that when they was boarding this vessel. And so embedded in these artifacts are the voices of these ancestors from my experience. When I dove on the South Jose, it was an incredible experience when I first saw the very first visual of a piece of that ship. When I saw it, I reached out and grabbed it. And when I touched it, I could sense the horror, the pain, the screams that was embedded in that artifact. So there's another sort of perspective in how do we listen to those voices. On the Clotilda, it's very, very special because it's in water that the visibility is almost zero. But there's this guy down in Australia who kind of wrote about this, right? He said if you have to really have another sort of perspective. He was dealing with Aboriginal people in Australia and their artifacts. He said the spiritual dimension, when you're looking at these things, has to be paid attention to. When you're dealing with shipwreck sites in which people have perished, an awareness of the spiritual element is vital if the best outcome for the sites is to be overcome. He went on to say that natural prescriptive processes, all the prodding and probing, do not work when managing the intangible aspects of these artifacts. But unless such issues are addressed, there will be a continuing disconnect between the best outcomes for collections and for traditional owners of cultural information. Once sensitized, able to feel for traditional owners of cultural information, once you're sensitized to capturing and working with intangible elements, these folks will be transformed into a new realm of having a deeper understanding of what these artifacts represent. So, with that experience in diving on the Clotilda and the South Jose, this is the South Jose here. These are those sonar images that we saw earlier over time, 2018, 2020. You can see the disarticulated pieces here, down here. These things here are big trees, 3 to 4 feet in diameter, or 50, 60 feet long. And they just come down river and slam into the Clotilda. This is what it looked like after we cleaned it up. We deposited some of those trees over there. So to give you a sense here, this is the river bank here. This is the bow of the ship. You're looking upriver this way. The river is flowing in this direction. This is going out and toward the middle of the river. So this wreck is laying up on an embankment and a diagonal like this. At this end is about 8 feet. This end is about 20 feet. This is the stern. And so that's the lowest part of the vessel. And so this sonar images show that forecastle, that's where we deposit all those pieces. This is the back of the ship, the lazarette, and these, what's more important are these things here, the walls in the ship called bulkheads. The owners put a temporary wall in right here, but what's more important here, we know what this space here was here. What was that space?
The people.
That's where the 110 was from the crossing. The 2.5 mile crossing was in that space. And that space is about from this wall here to where Baba is, roughly. Just about this wide. 110 individuals in that space for 2.5 months. All the vermins, everything coming out of their bodies. Horrific. And the water is the turbulence of the water. Again, this is just one experience of the 12,000. 2.5 months. So we know that space. And again, I knew the space was going to be very, very emotional for me going into that space. There's no other space like that in the historical record. There's no other artifact like that that exists of the 12,000 ships that we dove on. And so I knew it was going to be a challenge. So this is what, looking at the bow of the ship. This is the bow of the ship to give you a sense of the visibility. You virtually cannot see anything. So you have to really see with your hands. You have to listen with your hands. And when I dove it, you have to go inch by inch up close. You have to get this close in order to even see the vessel. And so it's you can't really discern much like this. So you just have to listen and feel your way. So I feel my way down the bow, down the starboard side, and I got to that bulkhead. And I knew this was the space where our ancestors experienced that horrible crossing. And so I went a little further. I grabbed hold of the gun wall, the top of the side of the hull. I kicked a couple of times and went over into that space. And as I said, I got some 1,400 dives under my belt or more. And I know something about stability. Peak buoyancy is very, very critical. But when I went in that space, I was just tumbling. Tried to get up right and tried to get my balance right and so forth. I was just tumbling for about 10 to 15 seconds before I was able to kind of get the buoyancy right. And I guess, they were trying to tell me or give me a sense of what they sort of experienced. I got there, got stabilized, and I started probing, doing the work. There was a deck. The floor of the ship is gone, but the supports, these posts that it was laying on, where the individuals laid, were still there. We probed those, investigated those. There was another shelf halfway up the hole, sticking out a bit. Some of that is still there, but they had some of the individuals laying, packed in as well, on both sides. And as you go further down the space, it's filled in with about 5 to 6 feet of sediment. You stick your hand down in there. Of course, you can't feel anything, but we know that might be some things down there up against the bulkhead under all these sediments. The ship was like this. The materials rolled down and hit that wall. And so there's very likely some things down there. Haven't been investigated or interrogated yet, but that's yet to be done. But more importantly, what also might have rolled down there is DNA material that might be preserved in that sediment. So we took some DNA samples and see if we can make some connections with the current descendant community. So again, I knew it was going to be a very powerful experience diving on that wreck. This is me about to enter the wreck. And before I got in that wreck, I said, I need to make a connection here. And because I knew it was going to be moving. And so I talked to a friend, Sabrina, you'll know Sabrina, and we decided to compose ancestral prayer. And here's the prayer. An ancestral prayer, first dive on the Clotilda, reviving the spirits who traveled on the Clotilda. Beloved ancestors, your voices have been quiet for 162 years, but your silence ends now. Your voices and memory are lifted from this wretched vessel through us as we welcome you to speak through us. Our connection will never be broken. We are because of you. Thank you for reaching out to us. Blessings to your spirits always. And after reciting that, we went in. Brought a little bit of calm. So those artifacts that we pulled off the wreck, there's a little small museum that's being erected. It's going to open on July 8th of this year. And July 8th is significant because that's the day of the disembarkation, of the landing of the Clotilda. More importantly, we're reaching out to the community. This is some of the instructors that I put together. We're putting together a swim to scuba program to teach young folks in the extended community how to swim and ultimately get them certified as scuba divers, with the ultimate aim to have those descendants dive on the Clotilda, where their ancestors came over here. It's going to be a powerful experience. Can you imagine this young man here? He was very eager and excited, diving on that vessel where his great-great-great-great-grandparents came from. Nothing like that would ever happen anywhere in the world because only the Clotilda, all of this Clotilda exists. So we'll be going down the next month to continue the program. COVID kind of arrested it a little bit. This was in 2019. So we're starting up again next month. You've seen some of the documentaries, on Netflix. Nat Geo. If you just go on Nat Geo and YouTube, exactly, and just search for Clotilda, these documentaries will come up. This one that Nat Geo did, and this is the one I was speaking of earlier. That's streaming on Netflix right now. Hopefully you've seen it. Called Descendant.
Yep, really good.
Real nice.
Good job, Papa.
Something, bro. These are exhibitions that say you've seen, been to the museum, and so we're trying to continue to work. DWP, continuing to search for the Guerrero. As one anthropologist says, he's pretty confident knows where it is, but there's still some more sites that needs to be investigated. The Wanderer was the next to the last vessel, right before in 1859. It brought almost 400 Africans into the U.S., into Jekyll Island, Georgia. So if you're ever down near Jekyll Island, they got a nice memory trail down there to tell the story of the Wanderer.
Why is 1871?
That's when it sank.
Oh, it sank.
So yeah, it brought them in 1859. When the war happened, Civil War happened. The Union took over the Wanderer and repurposed it as a Union vessel. It was militarized, and after the war ended, it was sold to an industrialist who used it to haul freight up and down the eastern seaboard and to Cuba. And the Wanderer sank right off the eastern coast of Cuba. It was in Cuba back in July and trying to get hooked up to really find this vessel and tell that story.
Now, what part of Georgia again?
Jekyll Island. Jekyll.
Island.
Yeah. The Aurora, another incredible story. It was in Mozambique back in August, and this vessel had over 700 individuals on it. This was taken, you saw where the South Jose people came from. The other 700 came from that very same location, came down that same ramp. But when they got loaded up and was going to get underway, there was a revolt. And divine invention or whatever, when that revolt happened, a storm came up, they lost control of the ship, and it slammed into the reef on the northern side of Musselville Bay, and it sank. Unfortunately, about 400 of our ancestors perished in that sinking event. But this past August when we were there, we found it. We found that ship. And more importantly, we found up the side of it, it's about this wide. You have the outer hull planking, the inner hull planking, and then the framing in between that. We found a large section of that. We took some samples of it, and those samples verified that this is the Aurora. You had those ballasts in it that I mentioned earlier, but they always used rocks. We know from the historical record, it stopped in Mauritius before it came into Mozambique and collected those rocks. We had a geologist look at those rocks. They came from Mauritius. And there's a number of other indicators that we found in this vessel. So that story is going to be breaking this soon.
What's the name of it again?
Aurora.
Aurora.
So there were, you said about 700,
700,
so
it was a
about
massive-
400 perished. What happened to the other 300?
Some of them waded ashore. The water was shallow, some of them waded ashore and tried to free themselves. I really don't know exactly what happened to them, but we know from the
So they weren't recaptured or anything
No.
like that. They were
Yeah. not to our knowledge.
yeah.
And so I told you the story about the Lewiston, and this one is here is really exciting. We got the blessings of Julius Garvey to work on the 2 of the Black Star Line ships.
Mhm.
We know one is off the northern coast of Cuba, and another one is was using as a paddle steamer up in the Hudson River. We know the captain. The captain wrote a book about his experience of piloting one of these ships. He actually kept the anchor. We found the anchor. We know where the anchor is. It was rusting away in this guy's yard up in upstate New York. And so we're working to get that anchor and properly conserve it. We have to tell the story.
Mhm.
And so looking forward to working on that project for sure. So that's it. So thank you all for listening. And typically what I do in terms of this memory recollection process. I'm tired here, but anyway, I usually end with, you've heard of Listervelt Milton, right? You remember Listervelt Milton?
Yeah.
He wrote this powerful piece called On the Origins of Things, right? And there was a refrain in there he said, and it says, he actually wrote it for the children. And then the refrain goes something like, minute by minute, hour by hour, as you lose your history, you lose your power. So open your eyes and tune your ears so you know what you see and understand what you hear. Sante San, thank you all.
I think she had a question.
Yeah, so that question you had.
Yeah.
Did I answer it?
How do you choose
How do you determine what to work
what
on?
you're gonna
Yeah.
do?
So it's not so much choosing, it's more of what we know about these individual vessels, and are we able to get the resources together? These are very expensive projects, but if we know a lot about the vessel, and particularly if they have a lot of historical significance, we'll say that's a great one to work on. But we don't say this one is better than the other one. We treat all of them as very sacred sites. So if one just happened to kind of got the resources and everything sort of aligned, we might start out on working that. Like the Camargo. So I've got some Brazilian colleagues that we're working with down there. That's the Camargo was the vessel that was piloted by Nathaniel Gordon, the guy that was hung by Lincoln for pirating. But there's connection from that vessel to the South Jose and even to the U.S., which is an incredible story. So it depends on resources. It depends on how we can pull people together. It depends on timing. It depends a lot on the condition, on the environment where they exist. Whether we can pull the right folks together to deal with that particular environment. Each one of these environments are very different. Some of them is very hazardous. A few is very deep, that you need certain skills to dive very deep. So all those kind of factors are brought into the picture, and then we decide whether we can make a project out of it. The QR code work?
I'm trying, probably too
It
far
works
away.
with iPhones for sure, yes.
Yeah, I went down to the museum a few years back. And they got the guys who had these ships, they kept good records.
Mm-hmm.
And they had
Yeah,
records down there at the museum of almost every voyage.
Yeah, there's a database called the Slave Voyages database.
Yeah.
They've documented thousands of these voyages. Yeah, and some of the companies, because this was an investment for them,
Mm-hmm.
they kept meticulous records. The Dutch East India Company, they kept meticulous records. Every time there was a record event, as you saw, the captain survived. The world survivors were, they deposed all of them. Trying to figure out what happened. And so those records still exist in the archives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we do that research initially as a vessel of interest. So we try to pull together all we can on the Wanderer for sure. There's a couple of good books that's been written about it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those archives are very important.
Yeah. I also heard you mention Charles County.
Mm-hmm.
I heard you mention that reading. I thought that was done a lot on the Eastern Shore.
Eastern Shore as well, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a plantation down in Charles County called Solidly. You heard of Solidly?
I remember you talking about that.
Yeah.
Where was that in Charles County? Do you know?
Hollywood, familiar with Hollywood?
Oh, that's right. You said Hollywood. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with Hollywood.
Yeah. Yep. So, at this point, I'm not surprised about anything. It's just incredible, and we know very little about it. Folks think that they can talk, quote, intellectually about so-called enslavement, but this stuff is so deep, so broad, so intense.
Yeah.
I would say start with the slave narrative if you want to really get first-hand accounts.
You familiar with the book, Bullwhip Days?
Bullwhip Days.
Mm-hmm. Those are slave narratives, real thick book.
Mm-hmm.
I told Baba Kalashi about that.
Yeah, I haven't.
And
Okay, I'll
the
check it
school
out.
that his daughter go to, DeVal High School.
Yeah.
All these names of these schools and towns,
He was
especially
major
Charles
slavery
County,
family.
named after former
Yeah.
slave
Yeah.
owners.
Because they had the wealth of Maryland. Maryland was a slave state. That's who had the money. They had the money to buy the land and build these.
Again, folks making an argument that enslavement of African people had nothing to do with the founding of America.
Come on, man.
And there's a good book just came out, Cast. Which it's not necessarily new information for us, but it just puts in a different task, different language. People caste is, race is so sensitized that people oftentimes, once they hear racism, they just turn off.
Right.
But caste is something that's still, it's more associated with maybe India, but that's essentially what it is. It's an arbitrary system created by men and women to